Okay, so today we're going to talk about, it's not new, it's been around for a while, and apparently it's been revamped. We're going to talk about the turbo mode for X3D CPU, specifically on the Aorus and Gigabyte motherboards. This isn't the first brand that's done that. I mean, the turbo mode button has existed, going way back to like 286, 386 and all that. Anyway, I digress. The turbo mode does a few things when it comes to X3D CPUs, specifically it does more things with multi-CCD X3D CPUs, and we tested that today. We tested what it's like just out of the box, just turning on Expo on RAM, running some titles, then turning on the turbo mode, or specifically the X3D turbo mode found in the BIOS. And then I went ahead and just did a quick and dirty PBO, or Precision Boost Overdrive, on the CPU to see whether or not you should even bother toggling that button, or if it's going to cause you more performance loss rather than performance gain. Today's video is brought to you by our brand new GPU Apocalypse 2.0 shirt, kind of immortalizing all of the stuff you love about today's GPUs. Our GPU Apocalypse 1.0 shirt was actually one of our most famous and popular shirts, and now it's re-immortalized with GPU 2.0. But let's face it, the Apocalypse never went anywhere, it just evolved. Just like this shirt. Go buy it now. So this is a pretty relevant topic, especially as the popularity of X3D CPUs continue. First and foremost, let's go ahead and talk about the different CPU structures and how turbo mode will affect each one of those. So the turbo mode button in the BIOS is essentially the same thing as what you're gonna see. Why my voice crack right there? It's so chilly. Anyway, moving on. The turbo button is not that different than what you would find in like Ryzen Master's game mode. But what Ryzen Master game mode does, and I'm making sure that I enunciate that very clearly, the game mode in Ryzen Master essentially just disables one whole CCD. It just disables a CCD in a multi-CCD CPU. So the CPUs that are going to be pretty much affected here are going to be the 9950 X3D, 9900 X3D, 9800 X3D, yes, I know it's a single CCD CPU, we'll talk about that in a second, and the 7000 series variants as well with those particular CPUs. So 7800 X3D, technically 7600 X3D as well, I believe, and the 7900 X3D and 7950 X3D. What I did not test, because core parking exists in all of those, what I did not test is whether or not the turbo mode actually makes a difference on the 9950X and 9900X, since those also are core parking CPUs, although they're not X3D variants. I do actually have my workstation upstairs is actually a 9950X, not an X3D, running the same motherboard. So I could just kind of sanity check it up there, but I digress. The button says X3D turbo mode, and I think it's gonna be most relevant to people running X3D CPUs. So when you push that button in Ryzen Master, the game mode button, which is not the same as the turbo button in the BIOS, just disables the second CCD. The reason for that is even though with core parking enabled, the second CCD is still taking up core voltage, it's still taking up cache, it's still present in the system. So the idea by turning off the extra CCD is you're increasing the responsiveness or decreasing the latency between any information that might bounce itself onto the other CCD. Depending on what your workload is behind your game, you could have your Windows could suddenly pop up something that's important, which could, like, let's say a background Windows update or something like that. Because you can park cores, you can't disable the cores. So if the CPU goes under a heavy enough load from background tasks, it could then activate that non-cache, high cache CCD, the frequency CCD. Now that cache is being shared between both, so is the RAM, and that's gonna increase latency because as the other CCD is doing stuff and accessing the cache, it increases latency between them. So that's why the whole idea is like, hey, why don't we just chop the CPU in half, and then the games will only have the 3DV cache core available to it. Well, if you're gonna run, in my opinion, if you're gonna run the ideology and you're running just a gaming system without any sort of major background or multitasking necessity, just get the 9800 X3D or the 7800 X3D. Then you won't deal with any of that bouncing around. You'll have full availability of cache and RAM and throughput and bandwidth to the CCD that matters because it's the only one that exists. But what's different about the X3D mode, turbo mode, found in the BIOS, specifically on this X870E Aorus Master, which is the F8 BIOS. It existed all along, it's just we're using the F8 for this testing, which is the latest BIOS. It not only disables the second CCD, it also disables SMT, or simultaneous multi-threading, or the AMD version of hyperthreading. That's the other thing you'll see a lot of people talk about on like Reddit and other gaming forums that specifically are talking about hardware, saying if you disable SMT, you might actually see an uplift in gaming performance as well. So the first thing I noticed with the 9950 X3D when I did this testing is we lose 3/4 of our threads. So essentially it's a 9800 X3D now that has also had SMT turned off. But on the third prong of what it does is it actually applies a little bit of an overclock available to the CPU as well. So it bumped up about 200 megahertz on average to that CCD. So we have 1/4 or 25% of the threads, but now we have a little bit extra clock speed, which we know clock speed and cache are king when it comes to gaming. So the idea there is that, hey, if we get rid of all that other crap, then we're gonna be able to get our FPS to run higher and more stable and less micro stuttering and jittering. Because what a lot of people will experience on X3D CPUs in a title, depending on how their CPU and their configuration is on their system, especially if they're running like the high performance mode in Windows and not leaving it on balance, because you want the scheduler to be able to put the game on the X3D CCD, not the frequency cache. If you leave it on high performance, it can actually bounce that task back around. And as it's moving back and forth between the frequency cache or the X3D cache, or sometimes one or the other, as that latency is increasing across the substrate, if you will, between the CCDs, that's what they're figuring out is causing the micro stuttering, not due to anything else. So like the FPS might look really high, but the micro stutter is also really apparent. So that's another reason why these game modes and X3D turbo modes exist, is to try and just kind of eliminate all of that. Now the downside here is when you enable that in the BIOS, that's it. It's like you software-wise fused off half of your CPU. Windows cannot go in and change the way that that CPU behaves through software. It has to be done on a hardware level during initialization. So when you enable that button and you turn it on and you lose SMT and you lose half your cores, or half your physical cores, that happens during the initialization phase when the CPU, the system restarts and is reposting. Basically, it tells the CPU, hey, just leave that other CCD off. Windows won't even see it. It will say you have a 9950 X3D, but it just simply won't have the hardware available to it. So the downside there is you've now just cut off half your CPU. Let's talk about what the performance hit was, and then we'll talk about what maybe some workarounds are so you can get the most out of your system without having to make this choice between whether or not you have to reboot every time you want to use all of your cores, or reboot every time you want to play games, specifically games that will benefit from the X3D mode. Speedway is a ray tracing test. This is done with my personal rig behind me. This is the 9950 X3D, 32 gigs of DDR5, 8000 mega transfer CL38 on the Aorus Master X870E on the F8 BIOS, running an RTX 5090 Astral with a water block. It's the Delta Mate block from Der Bauer, and it is running a overclock on the GPU. So the GPU is actually allowed to boost up to about 3225 megahertz depending on the load. It's a plus 300 core and plus 2000 on the memory. So I overclocked the graphics card because really where this scenario is going to look most beneficial is if we're hitting a CPU bottleneck. If we're not hitting a CPU bottleneck, changing a lot of this stuff around won't make any difference. If anything, it could hurt your performance. So if we look at synthetics right here, you can see essentially no change. And the PBO that I ran, Precision Boost Overdrive, was just level 3 in the dropdown of just like a one-click PBO. It's not like a curve optimizer. There's no offsets. There's a lot of tuning that needs to be done in this system to take full advantage of higher clock speeds and lower temperatures. This is just a one-button level 3 in the PBO dropdown inside the BIOS. But you can see right here we have a 15386 with PBO versus a 15377 versus turbo mode on versus a 15372. A complete range of 14 points, which is absolutely positively well within the run margin of error. So we could run this test 100 times and get that 14-point swing 100 times. Like, it's just, turbo mode had no effect on that. Makes sense, it's a synthetic. It's not a high enough FPS for it to have really sort of bottlenecked the CPU at all. If we take a look at Times by Extreme, which is a rasterization test and a much higher FPS, PBO level 3 gave us the highest score at 27,313. Turbo mode on gave us a 27,232. And then turbo mode off gave us a 27,180. So we bumped up about 50 points or 52 points by going turbo mode off to turbo mode on. And then we jumped up about another 80 points by just having the CCD turn back on, but then enabling PBO. Now my PBO off was about an additional 200 megahertz as well, so very comparable to what the turbo mode is doing in terms of PBO frequency changes, but it's obviously got everything enabled. It's not losing 75% of the threads available to it. Let's go ahead and talk about some gaming now. This is Borderlands 3 4K Badass preset, temporal AA, no upscaling, 3-run average in DX12. You can see right here, our best performance came from the X3D Turbo Mode on with a 193.7. But again, let's talk about run variance and run-to-run margins of error, because with PBO level 3, that was a 193.3, so 0.4 FPS difference right there. And then the no turbo mode was a 191.7. So we gained exactly 2 FPS average by turning on the X3D Turbo. But what you'll notice here is we gained a couple of FPS. We gained about 5 FPS in our 1% lows. And then essentially unchanged between the PBO level 3 and then the X3D Turbo Mode. Those are only 1.1 FPS apart. And then 0.4 FPS apart on the 5% lows. So again, all of this is in margin of error when it comes to run variance. If we take a look now at 1440p, it's pretty much the same story. But what's kind of funny is we have a 303.2 with turbo mode on, 303.3 with PBO, and 303.4 with just out of the box settings. So that just shows that we're really at the engine cap here. We found that the Borderlands 3 is right around 300 FPS engine cap, so that makes perfect sense. But what you'll notice right here is that with turbo mode on, our 1% and 5% lows are slightly improved, about 3 to 4 FPS on the 1% and about 2 FPS, well, about 2.5 FPS when it comes to the 5% lows. So once again, 2 FPS at 252 is way less than 1%. Like, again, run variance, absolutely indistinguishable. Let's go ahead and talk about here Avatar, Frontiers of Pandora, 4K. So our best run was X3D Turbo Mode on, 124.5, but again, no turbo was a 123.8 and PBO was a 123.3. All of these, once again, completely, if I ran this test 10 more times, I'd probably see them switch places 10 times. That's the crazy part about this. It's really no change. The 5% low and 1% low are, once again, within 1 to 1.5 FPS of each other. Completely a non-starter when it comes to the discussion. 1440p, exact same story. 209.4 with turbo mode on, 207.1 with no turbo, 206.1 with PBO. And then if we take a look at 5% and 1% lows, I think we got a 3.1 FPS swing between 5% and then exactly a 4 FPS swing in the 1% lows. So those 4%, did I say 4%? 4 FPS. Those differences are not noticeable. Cyberpunk. This is where it gets a little bit interesting because Cyberpunk we know is a more CPU intensive title. So our best run at 4K was with the out-of-the-box Expo 1 enabled, don't touch anything when it comes to the CPU at 67.5, PBO level 3, 66.3, and X3D Turbo Mode, 64.4. So Turbo Mode actually lost performance in the average at 4K. Now 4K is extremely GPU bound. So once we go into 1440p, you'll see right here, not much of a change. The no turbo mode gave us the best at 131.3 versus a 130.5 for PBO and a 127.9 for the X3D mode on. 5% and 1% lows within 1 FPS of each other, so nothing to really talk about right there. Let's go ahead and talk about percentage change though, because percentage change, like seeing the FPS numbers, you can tell right there by looking at it, like it's really having no effect, at least in these titles that we're looking at right here, which is just a sampling. So taking a look at the performance chart, let me explain how to read this real quick. This is all based on versus the out-of-the-box setup of the computer with Expo 1 running, which is the 8000 mega transfers CL38. So you're gonna notice 2 numbers on here, the X3D on versus PBO, and both of those are versus and percentage compared to the out-of-the-box settings, okay? So that's why you're only seeing 2 numbers on here, because the base or the 0 or no change would be specifically against the F8 BIOS with Expo enabled. So Speedway, also too, when you look at these numbers here and you see 0.09, that is 0.09%. So that is essentially identical, if you will. So you can see PBO and X3D on, you know, it's just I gained 0.03% on PBO or turning on turbo mode, and 0.09% on turning on PBO versus turbo mode. Times by extreme, a little bit higher of a change. We've got 0.19% change on turbo mode on versus a 0.49% change with PBO levels. Again, I have to really iterate the fractions of a percent that this is, because it might look like a big gap on the chart, but look at the range. The positive range only goes to 1.5% uplift, and the negative, as you can see, goes down to 5.5%. Because if we drop down to like Avatar, it's really interesting. With PBO on, we lost 0.4%, and then with turbo mode on, we gained 0.57%. So it's really interesting that that's the way that that worked out, but these are run averages, and I ran them 3 or 4 times each and sanity checked, and that's just the way the numbers land. So for some reason, having PBO on hurt us a little bit in that title, but again, it hurt us by 0.5%. So Borderlands 3 uplift across the board, 0.83% and 1.04%. So we gained 1% of performance with PBO, X3D Turbo on. But Cyberpunk was a loss. So with Precision Boost Overdrive turned on, we lost 1.78%. Still not entirely sure why that is. It could potentially also be because it's doing the level 3 PBO enhancement without the curve optimizer or the negative voltage to it. It could be slightly not throttling, but it could be hitting a power limit when it comes to the CPU, which is then going to allow it to probably drop clocks just a little bit. And yeah, I know it moves the PPT and all that out to astronomical numbers when it comes to the power limits and stuff, but it does increase the voltages too. And then the CPU could not be liking some of the voltage, which is dropping the clocks a little bit. So it can still throttle for reasons other than temperature and power limit. But when it comes to the X3D on, we lost 4.59%. And that is specifically because Cyberpunk is a very CPU intensive title. In fact, while monitoring the CPU usage, I noticed that with PBO on and the factory settings, the CPU is sitting at anywhere between 18 to about 25% util when it comes to total util. So when it comes to the turbo mode on though, and the util, I was noticing util up into the mid 80% on the CPU. So that means that single CCD with no SMT was being 80%-ish utilized, which is probably what led to some of our performance degradation here, because the CPU is having to handle not only all those frames being thrown at it, but everything happening with all the NPCs walking around, and Cyberpunk's a very CPU intensive title. Now that was in 4K. We move over to 1440p. It's kind of interesting. We actually lost less performance in 1440p versus 4K. In Cyberpunk, we lost 2.59% performance versus 0.61 performance with PBO. Everything else is exactly the same shape as you would expect versus the other chart. But what I thought was interesting is in 1440p, Borderlands, we lost 0.03% and 0.07% with turbo mode and PBO. But again, these are so within margin of error. Take that with a grain of salt. These are very fancy charts that are fun to make to basically say there's no benefit to running the X3D Turbo Mode in these titles that we showed. The trade-off, in my opinion, isn't worth it. It would be worth it if for some reason within the Windows environment, it could dynamically turn off, physically turn off the CCD so it's not even accessible to any of the processes without having to do a restart. Because it's the restart that really is going to become intrusive and annoying. You're like, okay, what game am I playing? Oh, this game actually loses performance with the X3D Turbo Mode, so I gotta turn it off and restart my system and go again. But the other thing too is if you have a 9950 X3D, you probably are favoring a dynamic system that is both great at multitasking and productivity as well as gaming. Otherwise, why would you have the X3D? You just have a 9950X if you were just doing multitasking, in my opinion, because it's also still a great gaming rig, but not as good, obviously, at the X3D capabilities. But then to turn off that function means you just paid for a bigger CPU to get the performance of a smaller CPU. Now, here's the thing. I was comparing some of these numbers to our charts, and I didn't chart this because, to be fair, it wasn't the exact same GPU, but it was actually performing about the same as our 9800 X3D, overclocked to 5.3 gigahertz all-core. And we were seeing the frequencies on average hit about 5225 on the 9950 X3D with the like turbo mode stuff and whatnot on. So, and the PBO. So in my opinion, it's like, if you're that concerned about gaming performance and latency and all that, you just go with the single CCD option. That's the 9800 X3D. If you need multitasking and such, you go with the 950 X3D, but you don't touch any of these turbo modes. You don't touch the game mode. It's to me, they seem like really neat bells and whistles. And I'm sure there's titles out there that probably heavily benefit by turning off the other CCD. It's just none of the titles that we use, and this is obviously just a fraction of them, actually saw any real tangible gain. It just, all it did was limit the capabilities of our CPU outside of gaming. So anyway, this was just kind of scratching the surface of what this turbo mode does, but it really does take the Ryzen Master game mode a step further with a small overclock on the CCD that's still active and disabling SMT. Now these are all things you can play around with manually too, without having to hit the turbo mode button and all of that. So yeah, there we go. I'm curious, what titles do you guys see that actually benefits heavily from disabling a CCD? And when I say heavily, I mean, we've got to be seeing like 5, 10, 15% improvement, because Gigabyte said up to like 20% performance improvement. But we know how those up to charts work, right? They have one title that it hits that, so they can legally say up to that performance. But then if you look at the median or across the board uplifts, it's like low single digit uplifts. I just don't think it's worth the trade-off. I think if you're that concerned, then you just get the right CPU for you. And there's nothing wrong with letting the 9950 X3D do its thing, because fortunately the latest AGESA and the chipset drivers and such are very good now at making sure that core parking is working as intended. It's very difficult now to actually get the system to no longer like core park properly, because that was the biggest issue with X3D CPUs in the early days. Was you still have to run Xbox Game Bar and game mode and all that, so it can identify the gaming task, and then it will core park properly. And that's without having to use like Affinity Lasso or any of that stuff, that third-party software. I mean, you can do that if you want to screw around with it, but it's so good now at working the way it's supposed to. In fact, I was double checking after turning off the X3D mode and only having one CCD. I was concerned, will Windows now somehow remove the X3D Vcache scheduler, and then when you re-enable it, will it come back on, or will it be like before, where if you dropped in a non-X3D core parking CPU, Windows would like remove that process, like this chipset process would no longer automatically run to core park properly? But it did. It went back to the way it was supposed to, and that's the way it works now. It's a lot better. It only took 4 years for AMD to really get that dialed down and working with the Microsoft team. But there you go. Just don't bother turning on the turbo mode stuff. It's not a gimmick, it's just not needed. It's just not needed. Anyway, like I said, please sound off down below with the titles that you know would benefit from this, because right now it just seems like a whole lot of snake oil.